Welcome to the latest instalment in our series of 10 to 15 minute sessions looking at a number of different environmental management issues that might arise within a business. My name is Michael Cordeau and I'm associate here at Walker Morris. I'm joined by Rachel Turnbull, who's a senior associate. We both advise businesses on environmental matters. This episode will look at issues in relation to water environment management. This is not intended to be a thorough or comprehensive look at all water management issues that you might experience. However, we hope that by raising some of the more common issues that are likely to arise, you'll have some familiarity with the issues and you will know when and where to obtain help. Okay, I think the first thing we need to be clear on is what do we mean when we talk about water environment management?
Well, I think when we're thinking about managing the water environment, we're thinking about sort of two different types of water, really. You'll have water that's naturally occurring on site. So it may be that you're operating on a construction site, a development site. So you might have water that's flowing through ditches on the site or really just rainwater that's falling on the site. You also might have what's commonly known as trade effluent. So that might be clean water that's brought onto the site but is used as part of the process for your business. So that water might be clean water when it comes onto site, but then is affected by the process that it goes through. So it might pick up, it might be used for cleaning and pick up cleaning chemicals, or it might be used for washing, things like that. But it's clean water that will be changed and then needs to be got rid of from the site. And then the sorts of things that can affect water that's on the site. So again, all very business specific, but if you may have sort of chemicals that are stored on site or used in some of the industrial processes, you may be dealing with sewage on site that can get into the surface water drainage system. You might have fuels that are stored on site. And the big issue that we've seen with a lot of our developer clients is silt pollution. So silt that's washed off from a greenfield development site into the local watercourse and then has caused issues for either fish or other invertebrates in the water system. So what we need to make sure is that sort of managing that water environment is making sure that you've got a plan in place so that you know that the risks that are generated from your site, how you're going to manage them, what will you do in the event of an incident, and how who's going to take responsibility for that. And we would always recommend that sort of water environment management is thought of at the outset. So whether that's a development that you're working on, if it's a business process, maybe it's a new process that you're starting on site, at the very outset, you need to think about how you're going to handle any water that is on site, whether that's diverting it away from particular processes or particular areas on site, or whether that's making sure that you've got protection in place for any surface water that may end up in the watercourse. So that may be sort of filtration systems, retention ponds, things like that, to make sure that anything that's done to the water on site is treated and kept, and that only clean water is discharged.
What sorts of things do businesses need to consider and factor into their water management planning?
Well, it's largely going to be dependent on the type of business that you operate. If, for example, it's a construction and development site, you're going to need to think about sort of more physical factors. So is the site on a slope? Is it in an area of high rainfall? Are you adjacent to a watercourse or have drainage or what have you flowing through the site? Are there any areas of particular environmental importance anywhere nearby? If they are, then you probably need to think about getting an environmental report at a very early stage. I would suggest even as part of the sort of land acquisition phase, so that you can have an expert come in and address or identify certainly any issues that might arise in the future. If it's, say, a manufacturing site that you're operating, then you're going to have very different issues to consider. So you'll need to think about the industrial processes that you're going to be undertaking on site. Are you going to be generating large amounts of wastewater? Is there anything that's going to happen on site that's particularly risky? So are you going to be storing chemicals, for example, on site? Or are you going to have large amounts of fuel storage, things like that? All of these things, if you think about them at an early stage, you can factor into the design of the site, think about the drainage, whether there needs to be sort of cut-off valves, things like that, so that you can address the risks and implement practical measures to stop those risks occurring. But it's much easier to do that at an early stage. I think the other thing is it's really not a case of one size fits all, because even on a factory that manufactures the same things, if they're in different geographical locations, they're going to have different risks. So one site might be near to a river, one site might not be. One site might have a particular, a contained drainage system on site, another may not. So businesses really need to think about what the risks are, how they can address them from a practical perspective at a very early stage. And these might be things like you may require sort of heavy engineering solutions. So you might require things like retention ponds or an oil interceptor, a sealed drainage system, so that if there is a leak on site, you can shut it off and it's not going to go into the watercourse. But you also need to think about having sort of policies and procedures in place so that employees on site know what to happen in the event that there is an incident. Where do they shut off the water supply? If there's a spillage while somebody is delivering chemicals to site, it's not just a case of hosing it down and out it goes into the drains, but making sure that people at all levels who are likely to be involved in managing the environment in the area are considered and are educated as to what they need to do.
Who has responsibility for planning and managing water on site?
Well, it's the responsibility of the business as a whole to make sure that they have got an adequate plan in place to manage any water that they are handling. Depending on the nature of the business, will probably impact the person that is chosen to be responsible. So that might be a site manager, it might be your EHS manager or EHS supervisor, it could be the managing director. It's less important as to who that individual is, and more important to think about making sure there is a designated named individual, because the problem is that if you don't have that person, when an incident does arrive and it's all hands to the pump, it's really hard to then decide who's going to do what. There needs to be already written down and put in place. The other thing to think about is if your business or your site is one where you have a number of third parties coming onto site. So you might have contractors who are coming on to do certain types of work, different phases of a development, for example. It's also important that they are educated as to what their own responsibilities are, because if you're a contractor coming into site, you may not necessarily have the knowledge that employees will have as to where the drainage shut-off is, what previous issues you've had with silt running off the site, for example. So it's really important that whoever does have responsibility for sort of managing that also make sure that contractors are briefed appropriately.
So why is this such an important issue that we have to spend time and sometimes significant money on?
So obviously the key point is that nobody wants to be responsible for causing an environmental incident. Not only have you got the costs of the works that you've already put in, but also the remediation costs can be astronomical. You've also got to think about any negative publicity that may arise as a result of an environmental incident. These days, environmental credentials are very high up on people's agendas. Depending on your local area, you may well have local residents who are, on the ball with these things, who are watching to see if you're doing anything wrong. Maybe they didn't want your site to be there in the first place. You've also got the media attention that will arise as a result of pollution incidents. Obviously, from a legal perspective, the issues in relation to failing to comply with whether it's a permit, a discharge consent, or whether it's causing a pollution incident, you've ultimately got the risk of enforcement action arising. So not only will that bring costs implications, but also it can have a knock-on effect. So if you're convicted of a criminal offence in relation to environmental protection, You may well have to disclose that on any future applications for tenders, particularly in public contracts, which can ultimately go against you and actually affect your chances of winning business in the long term. In terms of sort of practical precautions, a lot of our clients who have had issues with water management have failed to anticipate where things might go wrong at particular times. So it may be that you are undertaking a more high-risk activity at a particular time. So it may be you've introduced a new process on site, or you've changed the way that you do something. So, people aren't quite so familiar with how it's done. You may have relocated to a new site. A lot of the time it can be something that's out of your control. So it may be that you're undertaking a particular task and there's sort of severe weather. It might be particularly waterlogged at that point, or heavy rain that's causing a lot of surface water runoff. All of these things, if you have the knowledge that they might cause an issue, you can take sort of proactive precautions. Maybe you don't clear the topsoil on that site that day because you know that the next day is going to be heavy rain. So you're aware of it and you anticipate the issues, because although it may delay matters that day and you may not be able to do the work that you need to do, having to then spend the next few days trying to rectify and prevent the runoff taking silt down to the local river is going to cause you a much more significant delay. So it's really being proactive. Again, things like if you've got vehicles operating on site, you might have forklifts or tanker deliveries, things like that. You need to think about, do we need to barrier those storage tankers off? Do we need to put them in a different area of the site so that they're not as exposed to potential collisions or leakage when things are being delivered to site? All of those things, again, it's trying to anticipate worst case scenario, and hopefully that won't occur. But if it does, it's having those measures in place that can prevent it from becoming a real issue.
What should site operators do when things go wrong?
So with sort of water management, obviously things move very quickly in water scenarios. So the priority is always going to be to contain the issue if you can. So if something's gone wrong on site, how are you going to prevent that leaving site? Because that's ultimately where it's likely to cause problems. So thinking about what you can do straight away to minimize the impact on the environment. Once that's done, or once you've done the best that you can on that, the next step is going to be thinking about what's gone wrong, why has it gone wrong, are we going to need to investigate it, how are we going to prevent it from recurring? We don't want to have this issue again. At that point, you may want to think about whether you need to get independent advice. So again, whether that's an environmental consultant, whether it's legal advice, and actually you've got a big issue and you're worried that the regulators are going to get involved and that there may ultimately be enforcement action arising as a result. The key is to get legal advice early so that they can advise you things like how to secure the best mitigation, how to deal with the regulator, whether you need to self-report the incident. And to some people, that's, why would you voluntarily admit to a regulator that you've had a problem? But actually, if you demonstrate cooperation to the regulator, if you can notify them that something's gone wrong, but actually it's under control, you've dealt with it, you've put these measures in place, then that will actually go in your favour quite often, because you're proactively notifying them that you've had this issue. So it's considering whether you need to do that, and you may need to get sort of either external or internal legal advice as to whether you think that self-reporting is a good thing to do. It's also a good idea to think about, even from the outset, how are you going to mitigate not just any environmental damage that's been caused. So, for example, if you have polluted a watercourse, it may have had an impact on the water environment. So it may have affected invertebrates, it may have affected fish, it may ultimately affect sort of other organisms and things living in that water. How are you going to remedy that? Is it a case that you may need to restock with fish? Is it that you're going to need to undertake a cleanup organisation, or you're going to need to get contractors in to come and I don't know, soak up the oil that you've spit that's ended up on the watercourse. Things like that to try and mitigate any damage that's been done. And also, should it become an enforcement issue and the regulator needs to get involved, any proactive steps that you've taken to remedy the issue will have undoubtedly a positive impact on the outcome. So whether that's convincing a regulator that they don't need to pursue enforcement action, or if they do decide to go down that route, that you've done everything you can to make sure that it's a less severe punishment that you're ultimately going to face.